Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
This week on To the Contrary.
My mother's entire personal history was shrouded in mystery, and in these journals she describes witnessing her father commit a truly hellacious crime. I realized, this is what is missing from the story I'm trying to tell about America.
I'm Bonnie Erbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from varied perspectives. Today, we have the pleasure of sharing half an hour with E.A. Hanks. She is the daughter of renowned actor Tom Hanks and author of the new memoir, The 10. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So you're also a former staffer at Vanity Fair magazine and contributor to the New York Times. The 10 is about your solo road trip along Route 10 through the American Southwest, retracing a journey you once took with your mother, Susan Dillingham. In it, you blend your own personal history, travel writing, and real crime as you investigate family secrets and explore your own identity, memory, and legacy. Thrilled you could join us.
Thank you.
So why the 10?
Well, the 10, which is what, Angelenos call Interstate 10, which goes from Santa Monica, California, all the way to Jacksonville, Florida. It's kind of ocean to ocean. It's the 10 because that is the trip that my mother and I took the first summer after I switched custody between my parents. I had grown up in Sacramento, California with just my mother and my older brother. And midway through the 7th grade, when teenage herd dynamics are just about at their most brutal, the situation with my mom had been kind of devolving, and it finally sort of crossed that Rubicon into which I was finally able to sort of change up my custody arrangement. And the first summer after I moved to Los Angeles, my mom announced that she had bought a Winnebago and that we were going to drive Interstate 10 to the central Florida town where my grandmother lived and where, as I discovered, about 4 to 5 generations of my family is from. And that summer was kind of like almost like a Greek odyssey, in that my mother and I, who were not particularly speaking to each other at the time, she was so deeply wounded by the changes I had made in our lives. We were in New Mexico and Texas and driving through New Orleans in the middle of the night. And when I was starting to, feel like I wanted a bigger project, because at the time I was sort of, paying the bills by recapping television shows and writing jokes for other people, I remembered the 10 as kind of being the backbone of the American myth. It goes through these landscapes that are so fundamental to the dream of America, the Southwest, Texas, the Deep South, that it seemed to me that there was a rich artery of stories and narrative to mine that would mimic my own sort of sense of trying to place myself in that American myth and in the myth of my individual family.
And was it hard? Did you have to kind of move the pieces around, going from, I suppose, sequentially from this situation to another situation to another monument to whatever?
The book is a success in that it exists, but it is also a failed magazine article, and it is also a failed podcast. So originally the idea that I was sort of pitching was a story that had no personal stakes whatsoever. It seemed to me that the 10 went through a series of political theaters of immigration, infrastructure, climate change, and voter suppression. And that was the story I was trying to sell. And no editor was interested in getting that story from me whatsoever. But it wasn't until I found these journals of my mother in which she describes witnessing her father, who she never ever spoke about. And in fact, my mother's entire personal history was shrouded in mystery and through the veil of her inability to sort of keep reality in check. But in these journals, she describes witnessing her father commit a truly hellacious crime. And once I saw that, and immediately responded not as a daughter, but as a reporter, I think in part because that allowed some degree of emotional distance, I realized like, oh, this is what is missing from the story I'm trying to tell about America, which is me and my mother and the culture that we come from. Placing that in the larger narrative is what was missing. And once I had that piece, the book really came together as a book, and I was able to hit the road with sort of the compass that had been missing from all the previous iterations of the story.
I don't know if you can talk about the crime without, or what she was involved with, without closing any loopholes for upcoming readers, but can you? Is there anything?
So essentially, what I knew about my grandfather is that he was a military man, that he was a career, career serviceman, that he had served multiple tours and multiple wars. And other than that, my only interaction with him was twofold. One, I had once asked my father if I was a Save the Marriage baby, and he said, no, you were not, but you were a someone died and I feel the urge to create life baby, which was that my grandfather's passing precedes my entrance onto the world stage. And then the other was in the 8th grade. I was on the sort of classic American school trip to our nation's capital. And I peeled off from a trip to Arlington National Cemetery to see his grave. And when I reported that fact to my mother, she went to her room, closed the door, and didn't speak to me for like a fortnight. And I realized that I had transgressed some boundary that she had never communicated to me. And in the journals, I can see why, which is she describes her father sexually assaulting and murdering a young girl. And the sort of details of it are florid and in a major key. It's as bad as it can get. The way that I described it's like a podcast worthy crime, or at the time I thought it was. It turns out it's a book worthy crime. And it was sort of the definition of shock but not surprise, that if any part of this accusation was true, my mother's sort of failure to launch as a holistic kind of human being in the world made a lot more sense to me. But I had a deep curiosity about the degree to which these accusations were rooted in reality, because I understood my mom's relationship with reality was fluid.
Now, as a grown daughter, is it fair for a parent to hide that much?
I don't have kids, and I feel like you can't really speak to the ethics of parenting without literal skin in the game. But I can say that certainly I don't think my mother was choosing to keep things from me. I think she couldn't keep the events of her own life in order. So how could she sort of line them up for me to understand? But I do think there is something interesting and tricky about what shades of the truth do we share with our children, and how can we prepare them to handle, deeper and deeper complexity as they get older and are able to sort of take in more about the everyday humanity of their parents, people who, I think we all think of our parents as sort of like gods, whose cataclysmic meeting results in the center of the universe ourselves. And I think when you are getting older and you start to see your parents just as people who got pregnant, the mystery for me does not diminish. It actually deepens and becomes even more fascinating.
Tell me just a little bit about each parent and how whatever characteristic or characteristics you're describing impacted you?
My mother grew up in an itinerant military family, which is something I did not know until I did the book. They moved around an incredible amount, everywhere from Camp Lejeune to 29 Palms, deep in the Mojave Desert, to a Hawaii iteration that I was completely ignorant of. And she had a mother who was one of the first women in the family to ever graduate college. My grandmother was a very literate person. She was a very sophisticated person. She loved classical music and literature, and that is something she certainly passed on to her daughter. And my grandmother was also a Southern woman, and perhaps the great sort of Venn diagram between a Southern culture and a military culture is, oh, we don't talk about that. That is on the no-go list. My father is also from a family of one sister and three brothers, which, by the way, so am I. And he grew up just as itinerant as my mother did, but with a ever-changing cast of characters of step-parents and step-siblings who would enter the picture and then leave the picture. His parents split when he was quite young, and they both married and divorced many times over. And my parents met at Sac State College in Sacramento, California, and they were the theater kids. And they were not particularly close. They weren't dating or anything. What happened was my mother had her heart broken. And in the sort of lonely aftermath of a devastating breakup, she let the nerdy theater guy take a crack. And as they say, yada, 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 my brother Colin was born. And so these were two people who were doing the best with what they were given, and they were not given very much. They were given chaos, disorder, certainly a coping mechanism of art making and laughter. And even at that time, there were hints that my mother had a deeper struggle and was starting to be someone who heard the voice of God and answered it whenever she heard it. She was someone who began to feel that there were people hiding in the walls of her house and planning her destruction, and that my father was somehow colluding in those efforts. And so, as is pretty understood in mental health circles, her mental health was diminishing rapidly as she aged, excuse me. And as my older brother and I enter the scene, things really start to pick up. And by the time Colin and I are in our adolescence, my mother she has friends and sort of loved ones, but they're all kind of intermittently banished from her presence and brought back in. It was just a very chaotic and confusing time, in part because she was also an addict with a very serious problem for a large part of my very early childhood. And then, the great miracle of her life is that she was eventually clean and sober, and to the best of my knowledge, never relapsed. So, that's who you're dealing with. You're dealing with two sensitive, thoughtful, kind of broken children that crash up against each other in that safe space of a college campus where everyone is learning to be in community and make art together.
Going back and forth between Sacramento and LA, was that eye-opening? Because there's such, at least Sacramento, at least until 30, 40 something years ago, was kind of this idyllic American farm community.
Yeah.
And Hollywood is, if there's such a thing as an opposite, it's Hollywood.
One of the questions that sent me on the road was like, well, where am I from? I was born in Burbank, California. I was sort of raised to early adolescence in Sacramento. Then I switched custody and then was back in Los Angeles. And then, of course, in between, as all children of divorce know, there's weekends kind of spent. And it was like going back and forth between two different planets. You know, what Sacramento gave me, which is an immense privilege, is anonymity. I'm sure there's a lot of there are some people who over the past month have been like, Tom Hanks has a daughter, which, you know, which is evidence of how total that privacy was. And I was able to grow up in a time mostly before the internet, mostly before tabloids who focus on the children of. And that meant that I got to grow up without kind of like the white hot glare of public attention, which I think was really the making of me on some level, that I was able to grow up just, you know, mostly my mother's daughter and my big brother's sister. And then, you know, and that was a very insular sort of, it wasn't quite Grey Gardens. There wasn't quite as many raccoons, but there were definitely as many stacks of newspapers and books and dusty cans of pate. But then I would go and visit my Los Angeles family, where suddenly there's grandparents and cousins and uncles and 3 meals a day and family dinner every night. And it was and a phone that is always ringing, because essentially you're living in the corporate headquarters of Tom Hanks Incorporated. Whereas, you know, my mother's house, the phone hardly ever rang. And what we really had around was stacks of books and classical music playing. So it was very, very different. Yeah.
Were you surprised when you got old enough to get out in the real world and your father had by that point become famous? Were you surprised at people's reaction to you? Did they idolize you, or how did they treat you?
Myself?
Yeah.
No. I mean, it's, you know, I think most people would. I think I have a very vague memory of being like in the 5th grade and seeing reference to my existence in a magazine once, and I think the magazine described me as being the adopted Hanks. And I remember being like, look at my face. You couldn't, I stole his face and slapped it on top of my neck. It's I can't, you know, I had no concept of anyone being aware of me. I think for good reason, the vast majority of people have no idea that I exist. But I was aware, certainly, that my dad's kind of the degree of my dad's fame certainly changed at a very specific point. My older brother and I we call it BG and AG, which is before Gump and after Gump. The phenomenon of that film and the chord that it struck in the larger culture was such that it was just a cataclysmic upgrade of everything in our lives. I think it's fair to say that I was not born on third base, but we definitely moved there in the 90s.
Now tell me, what's the hardest thing about your personal life, about your family life, for you to have put in the book, and what was the reaction to it?
The hardest thing for me to put in the book was also the thing that I knew was entirely necessary for the book, which is my mother's poetry. Along with the journal with the accusation about her father, I find this binder of poetry of my mother's, which I knew that she wrote, but she never let me see it. And as I was going through it, I realized that a lot of the poems covered that road trip we took together in 1996. And certainly one of the more tricky things to explain to readers is that my mother had this concept of herself as sort of, she could have been a contender had not my dad's, as I describe it, catastrophic fame kind of obliterated her chances. But I and the majority of the people that I spoke to in her life all sort of understood that that was not the case, that my mother was not headed for great stardom as an actress. And that's a tricky thing, to show that level of vulnerability and delusion about someone you care about. And certainly as a fellow artist, we're all afraid that we're deluded about what we have to offer the world. But I also think that I got to kind of rescue her artistic ambitions by including her not as an actress, but as a writer, and editing her work with all of my experience as a professional writer and editor over the course of 20 years was a way of engaging with her um, in good faith as an artist. And I think that showing her work, because there's sections that are of her work that I show that are unedited and really show the depth of her madness. And it's very it's sort of like a confrontation. You know, you've been hearing about this person and their mental health, but when you kind of get a, you know, those you know, when scientists go to the Arctic and they drill down to get some core sample of ice that reveals, you know, deep truths about how the planet has existed, you know, showing my mother's poetry unedited is sort of like that Arctic sample of the deep core of what she was wrestling with inside of her own mind. And the pressure to get that right and to have people walk away with both sides of her, of the madness, but of the artistry that she did have and the taste and the skill that she did have as a writer, I think was something that I certainly fretted over almost more than anything else in the book, for sure.
And speaking of fretting, when it came out recently, did you ever have the thought that, gee, I think maybe I shouldn't have said that?
Knock on wood, not yet. Yeah, inshallah, not yet. But I think that I think any sort of concerns I had about that were really mitigated by the fact that very early on in this project, which is now you know, it's taken in total, perfectly enough, 10 years, I had a conversation with my older brother, who's really the true only other veteran of this war that was my mother's house that I can share this experience with. And then also with my father. So, you know, I recognize that there's no way I can tell my story of me and mom without occasionally, you know, swerving into both of your lanes. And I really can't attempt this without some modicum of blessing. And you know, you really can't get more supportive than, here, take my car. You know, and the very first sort of whole draft that I had of the book, the first people to read it were my dad and my brother. And they gave me the greatest gift, which was to say that this is a fair and accurate depiction of this woman who we all loved and feared on some level.
Loved and feared?
Yeah. I think
Why so?
Loved and feared will make sense to anybody who grew up in a house where the shadow of violence was ever present. And when the person that you love the most is also the person you fear the most, that is a very potent sort of alchemy of intimacy that exists between two people. I love my mother, and I was terrified of her. On a bad day, there was no more fearsome boogeyman. But on a good day, I never felt more seen or understood than when I was with my mother. And that's a complicated yin and yang to try and capture. And I hope I've done my best to do so.
Have you come to terms with it?
You know, I was at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books this past weekend, and I was on a panel with some really incredible writers, and we were in the it was a really cheerful topic. The panel was about grief, and there was this question about, do you write for catharsis? Do you write as therapy? And my response was, good God, no. You know, I think it's really important for readers to know that I did not write this book in this sort of immediate splash zone, as it were, of grief. My mother passed, 20 years ago. She passed when I was 20 years old. I'm now 42. And a good solid 20 years of therapy has happened in between then and now.
And do you have, on that note, and since we're getting to the end of our time, do you have ideas for our next project?
something that's adds kind of emotional oomph to the publishing of the 10 is that I actually received a book deal in my early 20s when I was straight off of the Huffington Post and a 4-hour news cycle, and I had no idea how to write a book. And I got everything I ever wanted with a book deal for a series of children's novels. And I choked hard. I choked hard to the point where I was not able to write for over 15 years. So the publishing of the 10 is not just the resolution of my mother and mine story, but of my own sort of creative recovery. So I'm happy to say that I am going back and finishing those children's novels that I'm very excited will be coming out in the future. So right now I'm all about coming home from a book tour, cleaning out the fridge, doing some laundry, and getting back to the desk.
Oh, well, all the best of luck to you, and what a wonderful story. Thank you so much, E.A. Hanks. Really appreciate your time. Everybody run out and buy the book. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Let's keep talking on social media, including X, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Reach out to us at To the Contrary and visit our website. The address is on the screen. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Park Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
You're watching PBS.